Good morning, everyone. My name is Greg Downing. I'm the President and CEO of the Business Council of British Columbia. Thanks very much for joining us this morning. I first want to recognize that we're video linking from around the province and many of the 203 First Nation territories that comprise BC. And I'm presently on the traditional lands of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And I want to thank them for their hospitality and ability to conduct business on their traditional territory today. At the conclusion of today's press conference, if there are any additional media questions, we would be happy to take them. And our goal is to be done by 12 o'clock today. I want to thank my fellow speakers, and I'll properly introduce them in just a moment. But we're here today to really talk about an element of our Stronger Tomorrow Starting Today plan that we released a couple of weeks ago, which is an economic plan for BC families and for BC businesses in this unprecedented time of a once-in-a-century economic recession that we're not only feeling here in British Columbia and Canada, but globally. In fact, recent reports show that 97% of countries around the world are experiencing an unprecedented recession. And while we work together very collaboratively on managing our health outcomes and our personal health, we now need that same collaboration to build out our economy. And the Stronger Tomorrow plan helps do that. One of the key component parts, however, of that plan is what we're about to talk about today, our low carbon advantage. We all know that climate change doesn't know provincial or national borders. In fact, if all 5 million British Columbians were to leave the province today, BC would still bear the brunt of climate change in terms of our weather patterns, impacts to our land, our water, and our air. But we will have only reduced China's emissions by about 2 days. And in doing so, we will have lost climate solution potential that's locked up in BC and Canada and BC and Canadian businesses as the low carbon solution providers to the world. We will also have lost the existing economic and high paying jobs that go along with them that are so vital to the families and communities of British Columbia, let alone the ability to create more and a clean economy moving forward as we, through innovation and commercially viable technology, as well as partnerships with First Nations, move forward as a province. So to level set this morning, I just want to quickly touch on a couple of facts. 75% of BC's merchandise exports come from our commodities and natural resource extraction that we do sustainably and we do very well and responsibly compared to the world. They also rely on the utilities and infrastructure and vast transportation sectors that are vital components to moving those products and to our economy and to the jobs of British Columbians. It's these large sectors of the economy that drive innovation. They drive and adopt that innovation in their businesses that ultimately results in higher wages and more opportunity for BC, contributing as much as 5 times more GDP for every hour worked compared to the industrial average in our province. While many of these sectors and their businesses support countless rural people and communities and jobs in those locations, what we often forget is that 50% of natural resource sector and energy jobs actually happen in the Lower Mainland. They're creating new technologies in engineering, trade jobs, manufacturing, transportation jobs, as I mentioned, construction, research, professional training, hospitality, and retail jobs, all resident down here in Vancouver. With this knowledge, 2 years ago, the Business Council discussed the opportunity with the Government of British Columbia and the federal government to advance this outsized impact potential that BC could have on reducing global emissions that cause climate change. And what would be needed for us to provide those low carbon products and develop those innovations in clean technology to export those advantages to the world. In addition to this conversation, under a practical plan, it was believed that this could accelerate the very innovation and companies that we're going to rely on to provide commercially viable technology to reduce our emissions here at home and build those clean technology solutions that help support Clean BC and its goals. So in turn, this would enable us to have sustainable economic development relationships and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. So many of those are happening today, but so much more could be done. It would enable us to attract investment, and this will lead to higher wage jobs, provincial revenues, but only if we're competitive and purposeful. So this resulted through these initial conversations with an MOU that the Business Council signed with the province of BC, specifically the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Strategy, Minister Heyman. The Premier announced this plan as a companion to Clean BC in the fall of 2018. And the goal was to create a low carbon strategy to validate our opportunity, as I said, as a low carbon supplier of choice to the world, and address the competitiveness challenges, if there were some, and the solutions that we could act on to mitigate those. So since that time, over the last 2 and a bit years, over 50 industry experts and organizations across BC's commodity, energy, transportation, and infrastructure sectors have been working together with the government of BC at senior levels and with their technical experts in an unprecedented effort. In fact, I've worked with governments now for over 25 years, and never in my career have I seen this level of collaboration, coordination, and purpose to identify the challenges and the opportunities available for BC and BC businesses and their employees. And so the focus was to look at our relative competitiveness and attract investment to create jobs and innovation. That's more important now than ever. So what did we find out after all that work? The results of this unique collaboration were that government business verified together using third-party professionals, Myers Norris Penny, MMP, and Leaf Consulting, as well as the most sophisticated data available. And we agreed that on average, BC's energy and commodities that we sell to the world are half the climate-causing GHG intensity compared to our competition. This equates to BC low-carbon commodities and energy having about 12 to 18 million tons less GHG emissions than our competitors. That's about a third of BC's total emissions and is significant. But we could be doing so much more if we had the ability to sell more to the world. But what we found was that we verified that for a number of geographical, but mainly complexity of policy, regulatory, and tax reasons, BC is a high-cost jurisdiction that is among the bottom half to bottom third of performers in those competing jurisdictions. And what it means is that this matters because commodity prices are set globally, not by British Columbia, and you need to be able to be profitable to attract investment to meet those commodity prices once they're laid out. And what we found, unfortunately, was that specifically the findings of that collaboration were that BC is at a disadvantage. On average, we are 11 to 87% less competitive on a return on investments in operations and or new projects, moving our commodity and energy opportunities to a smaller basket than they should be. And what this does, and we'll talk a little bit about it, is it puts at risk a key principle called carbon leakage, which means that our advantage goes to somebody else on the economic side, but it ultimately increases the climate impact as a result. We also found that BC is the only jurisdiction in the world without protections for emission-intensive trade-exposed industries and products. Places with a carbon tax like California, Norway, Sweden, and the rest of Canada, in fact, all have systems that avoid inflating costs that result in making their jurisdictions unattractive for investment and innovation. It means we are the first to shut down a shift, the last to expand an existing operation or invest in new lower emission capital projects or technology solutions. But it doesn't have to be that way. It turns out that there are solutions that we work together and that we are including in this plan. So what we're laying out today as part of our Stronger Tomorrow, Starting Today economic plan for families and businesses are clear recommendations for government working with business to address and act on the things stopping us from aggressively pursuing BC's ability to have an outsized impact as a climate solution provider with our export products and support homegrown innovation and companies through both reconciliation and new technologies that create good jobs for people across British Columbia. These are co-researched and co-created with governments, and the essence of this collaborative work has been built on the most sophisticated research we know that has been done in this way, and it informs and is the basis of this plan. So specifically in the plan, which you'll be able to find online, is that we, in order to achieve these low carbon advantages for British Columbia, and it realizes some of Clean BC's goals, that we've laid out 21 different actions at the federal and provincial government level, working with industry can help realize in 6 key pillars. Around regulation, which means cutting complexity and cost, not corners. creating a very specific business investment, marketing, and branding plan and course of action that's purposeful. Dealing with tax policy, which I'll speak to more in a moment. Addressing climate policy and things like market offsets. Infrastructure investments that help us get products to market and develop products more efficiently and at lower GHG intensity, and creating the conditions for innovation at a commercial level to be developed, adopted, and expanded, and exported as a new commodity for British Columbia. So a couple of the priority actions that realize this low carbon advantage are, first, leveling the playing field for BC businesses and workers with other jurisdictions. And this comes about because of the unique situation BC's in, I alluded to earlier. We are the only place in the world with a carbon tax that does not provide protections for trade exposed industries. And as a result, we bear higher costs going to market. That means lower margins and lower investment returns. So if you use an analogy, it would be like investing in an RRSP and getting 10% from two different RRSP providers. One has very high costs, one has lower costs that net out to mean you get better returns on the lower costs to operate that RRSP. And as a consequence, you're going to move your money over to that RRSP with the lower costs. And that's what carbon leakage is. It's capital leaving the province to go to other jurisdictions that create products with higher emissions profiles in BC that accelerate climate change, but BC loses the investment, the innovation, and the job opportunities. Secondly is we're asking that the government of BC create a commitment to signal on two key elements. One is a policy that avoids carbon leakages through tax, regulatory, and that leveling of the playing field through our energy intensive protections. But secondly, is to create the inclusion of an offset market mechanism as a policy compliance tool in our toolkit. That allows governments, as we see last week, the provincial government using offsets to reduce their total emissions. And it allows companies that are seeking to get to net zero emissions in their operations by 2050 to do so. So we've experienced that when we go to buy an airline ticket. Companies around the world, like financial institutions and others, will be looking to buy high quality verified offsets to reduce their total emissions where they can't do that going forward. And this can be done in BC using both sequestration tools that are called nature-based, meaning planting of trees and using soil through agriculture, but also technology solutions in sequestration as well. The next is a real and verified technological transactional opportunity for BC to advance these offsets. So for example, you need to verify them, you need to create them, and then you need to sell them. And we've been working now with Indigenous nations on the possibility of their partnership and leadership in this area for the last 10 months. The second is a very clear policy for the government of British Columbia to move forward on an investment strategy that really leverages our low carbon advantage and attracts investment that creates jobs in British Columbia. And so collaboratively, we can work together to realize this opportunity. BC's low carbon advantage, something that other jurisdictions are envious of and are working purposefully and competitively to take advantage of. And BC now needs to move with urgency to do so. And it's pleased now to introduce a couple of speakers that we've been working with over the last couple of years to really fulfill this plan and validate the information that you see within it. So our first speaker is Susanna Pierce. Susanna is the Director of Corporate Affairs with LNG Canada. Susanna, over to you.
Great, thank you everybody, and thanks for taking the time out of your day today to listen to this strategy. I don't think it comes as a surprise that in my position at LNG Canada, the real purpose of this project is to take the LNG that we can produce here in British Columbia and bring it to the countries that are desperate for lower carbon energy for a number of reasons. One of which is because they need to clean their air. They need to back out the coal-fired facilities that have been supplying many of their industry and their homes and their buildings. And they also want to make sure that they are also doing their part in addressing climate change. Just over the last month, we heard about policy in Japan and shutting and accelerating the shutdown of coal-fired power plants. We've seen that in Korea. We also know that's happening in in China. So it continues to be a place where we have the opportunity in British Columbia to produce LNG, liquefied natural gas, with the lowest amount of carbon per ton. And then we can bring it to the countries that need it most. And essentially, as Greg was saying in the beginning, avoid additional carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases that would be emitted in other competing jurisdictions. This government, the BC government, has come a long way. They have been and continue to be a leader in addressing climate change. And quite frankly, right now, because we know the situation is so important, we need every tool in the toolbox. Every tool in the toolbox, including many of the things that Greg spoke about this morning. But we also cannot continue to believe that our action alone in one province or even one country is enough. We need to be able to recognize that in many parts of the world, they don't have access to the energy that we can provide them with the lowest amount of greenhouse gases intensity. So this is our opportunity. It's also our opportunity to make sure that we rebound, we recover as effectively as we can to generate all those jobs that we know BCers need. And right now in our project, we continue to focus on that, and we continue to build and bring a lot of jobs and opportunity to BC. We want to see that continue. So it's a great opportunity, I think, to recognize the position that British Columbia is in and continue to progress as a leader in climate change, but also a leader in low carbon development, providing prosperity to the province. Thank you, Greg.
Thanks, Susanna. Our next speaker is Susan Yurkovich. Susan is the President and CEO of COFI, the Council of Forest Industries, and look forward to Susan's commentary. Again, intimately involved in this work over the last 2 years on behalf of the forest sector of British Columbia, which makes up about 25% of BC's merchandise exports.
Thanks so much, Greg. You know, the Council of Forest Industries has been really proud and pleased to be part of this low carbon advantage planning. We know that climate change is such a serious challenge for all of us, and that's why we think it's really the right time to build on our reputation as a leader in low carbon products, including the many high quality forest products that are manufactured by skilled workers all around our province. In our sector, forests absorb carbon, wood buildings and products store it, and then young trees we replant, continue that cycle. And so when you look around our province, in virtually every corner of our province, you can see examples of, for instance, low carbon wood construction. If you look at the Southern Okanagan Secondary School in Oliver or the O'Dane Art Museum in Whistler, we were the first in British Columbia to build a multi-story wood frame building with the Wood Innovation and Design Center in Prince George. And if you've been to UBC, you will see that the Brock Commons building was the tallest mass timber structure in the world until it was overtaken by a tower in Norway last year. But what's really impressive about that tower is the amount of carbon that's stored in the tower is the same as taking 500 cars off the road for a year. And so when we look around the world, cities are looking to both mid-rise and tall wood structures to build beautiful, affordable, but most importantly, carbon-friendly buildings. And that's only one of the ways that forest products are working to address the climate change challenge that we all face. More and more, our consumers are looking to products that are made from renewable and sustainably managed fiber because they are better choices for the planet. The challenge for us is they have options. Other countries see too the same opportunity. Competitors that don't have the low carbon advantage that we enjoy here in British Columbia, but do have a competitive advantage because they can operate and produce products at a lower cost. So for us, if we're going to seize the market opportunities ahead, there's just no question that we have to level the playing field. We need to do what it takes to create the conditions for BC to capitalize what we see as a perfectly natural advantage. And that includes what Greg talked about, putting in place smart, well-designed climate policy, including carbon pricing, that reflect global best practices, while also ensuring that our local industries are competitive. Our companies here and other sectors like the forest sector, they want to invest here. We want to continue to diversify our products, to innovate, and to continue to offer good family supporting jobs. But if they're going to do that, they have to be able to compete. And so from our perspective, we see that this is not the time to be shy. We've got this great low carbon advantage, and we also fortunately have the people, the resources, the know-how, and the ability to lead in this area. And so we see, we can envision BC as a center of excellence, a place that the world looks to for the next big idea on how to use our resources in a way that has a lighter climate impact than ever before. And as Greg talked about, we've got an opportunity. We can leverage and support the objectives of Clean BC, which the province has put out. And we can do this, importantly, what Susanna just mentioned. It's really important because in doing so, we can also get people back to work as we head down a long road of economic recovery. So we see, supporting climate solutions and jobs going hand in hand, and we have this opportunity. And if we get it right, we'll also create new kinds of job in the forest sector and many other sectors around the province, capturing the opportunity to export our products, our services, and our expertise around the globe, and in turn supporting jobs and communities and families right here at home. And that's something that we in the forest sector are extremely excited about and what we look forward to working collectively to achieve. I'll turn it back to you. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Susan. One of the great privileges of my job is I get to travel the province and meet leaders like Susanna and Susan, and also employees that are so proud of what they do and the innovations and the way that they do the work on behalf of British Columbia and the companies that they are employed with. And we've got such an opportunity to make a material difference around reducing climate change globally, but also driving the innovation that creates opportunities in a transition to a low carbon economy here in British Columbia. And as Susan said, that supports the goals of Clean BC. The reality that we find, though, is that the rest of the world aspires to do what BC accomplished in the 1950s through the 1980s with renewable hydro and low carbon content electricity and energy supplies. In fact, as many of you know, BC at 97% clean electricity is the envy of the world. And it's why, in part, we've got some of this advantage we're talking about today. But this means that reducing our emissions here in BC is more complicated and more costly. And we're going to need to rely on commercially viable technology and more efficient processes. And that starts with a competitive level playing field to attract that investment to make that reality. So to be clear, this isn't about getting rid of the carbon tax. BC businesses support the carbon tax, as Susan said. In fact, the Western Climate Initiative that supported the implementation of universal carbon taxes in 2007, 2008, particularly around Western US states and within Canada, was signed by then Premier Campbell and Governor Schwarzenegger with the Business Council at our offices. And at that point, BC proceeded with the carbon tax as the world faced the 2008 financial crisis. And the rest of the world, however, didn't follow through. Many still haven't. But when they did start to apply carbon taxes, as we talked about today, in places like California and globally, places like Sweden and Norway, and more recently, the rest of Canada, they've structured them to protect the large GDP contributors, those sectors that pay high wage jobs and drive innovation. Those emissions intensive trade exposed industries and products that pay our provincial bills. So this leaves BC as the only place in the world and only province in Canada, for that matter, that does not afford these kinds of protections for things that we want to sell to the world that are virtuous, not just because they're made with pride in British Columbia, but because their intensity of GHG that causes climate change is on average half. So if we level the playing field, we can create new jobs and new opportunities, as Susan and Susanna alluded to. We can stop carbon leakage of investment that was bound for British Columbia, but goes to a place where there's greater returns, less complexity, and more opportunity. It enables us to stop the things that hold us back of this opportunity to be a global solution provider for the world while also meeting our Clean BC targets. So for example, the government recently announced that we want to have electric vehicles purchased by everyone in the province in the coming decades. Many of those are made in Asia. If we had BC LNG and BC Copper supplying them, we would be reducing the carbon intensity of those vehicles as we bring them back to BC. Electric vehicles take 4 times more copper than combustion engines. Or if we made face masks or new housing from BC pulp and forest products, we would be able to sequester carbon at lower intensity. Or the cell phones that we use or solar panels that we may deploy in the future would be made with BC aluminum, which is about 1/5 the carbon intensity. Or the BC gas that we produce that supports LNG bunkering to reduce global shipping emissions in the port of the future. All opportunities that are technology driven, clean technology driven, and opportunities for jobs, businesses, and the people of British Columbia. So the plan is going to take some work to implement. And as I said earlier, we've been able to demonstrate that with common purpose through collaboration during COVID-19, we've looked after ourselves from a health perspective. And it's through that common purpose and collaboration that we can advance the low carbon advantage for British Columbia and British Columbians. It's important for rural and for urban BC and getting people back to work in meaningful, clean technology jobs that benefit our province and the world and our fight against climate change. And this is a plan that has meaningful opportunity for First Nations to own businesses, to be partners with global companies, and drive climate solutions on their traditional territory that create economic opportunity and self-determination. It's a plan that commits to practical transitions to commercially viable new technologies that we can develop here in BC and across the country, and adopt those for lower emissions and build new clean technology companies and jobs that are resident in BC that we can be proud of. And the plan is based on science and facts and is detailed and practical on how we can leverage the low carbon advantage of BC. The plan's available at lowcarbonadvantagebc.ca, and I'd encourage you to take a look at it. It's a plan of action that seeks to build back better with climate reductions that BC can achieve here and around the world as a low carbon supplier of choice. It allows the opportunity, as I said multiple times, for high paying jobs and getting people back to work in every part of British Columbia, driving innovation, driving economic opportunity, and a low carbon future of tomorrow. So with that, I want to thank Susan and Susanna for their leadership in BC's industry and also with respect to helping put this plan together. And I want to thank everyone that works in the natural resource, transportation, innovation, and export sectors that ultimately are going to have to do their job as well as they've done it in the past going forward to realize this opportunity. I'm now going to turn it over to Coast Communications for some questions from the media.
Thanks, Craig, and thanks to all of our speakers. If I could please invite any media that have questions to first ask on the chat. If you could kindly add to your question on the chat your organization name, and then we'll just hold for some additional questions later on from members. So the first question we have, Greg, is from Jay Hainsworth, who I think is from Glacier. You asked about definition of a low carbon advantage, and then a follow-up around sequestration and forests and technical sequestration, and an explanation on that, including reference to some of the things happening in Saskatchewan around carbon capture.
Yeah, comprehensive question. So really two parts. One is the low carbon advantage, and it's the essence of the first part of the work that we did, Jeremy, with respect to our collaboration with the province and through Myers Norris Penny, whose report is available online as well. And what we found is that if you took a molecule of gas from BC with the places that we compete with globally, whether that's the south coast of the US or whether it's Iran or Qatar, that on average that molecule of gas, when it gets used, is half the GHG intensity of those other competing jurisdictions. In other words, when it's used, you're contributing half of the GHG climate causing impacts than you would if you used BC gas. Pardon me, if you use BC gas compared to South Coast gas as an example. And that's true of, and it's released in the report, it's true of all of the commodity sectors we looked at. I alluded to aluminum earlier, which is 1/5 the carbon intensity. And in some instances, that advantage is based on geology, where, for example, met coal, that is steel-making coal, that we rely on for things from cell phones to cars to others, has lower emissions when it's extracted from BC compared to Australia. But in addition to that, it takes longer to get to market because of the Kootenays, where in the northeast of BC where it's located, so a bit of a disadvantage. But then you layer on top of some of the cost side that I alluded to earlier around a unique application of carbon tax without protections that the rest of the world gets, more complexity and more cost with respect to regulations in BC, and a variety of other component parts that ultimately make it complicated to make investments in British Columbia. And so what we're doing with this plan is saying, look, we've got a whole bunch of products that the world wants, and there is a global price for these products. Let's make sure that we can get them into the marketplace and do it in a way that is competitive. If not, the investment that we've experienced in British Columbia is going to go elsewhere, and we will have knowingly increased global emissions, but secondly, lost the economic opportunity and the investments necessary to transition into commercially viable technologies and clean technology to reduce our own emissions domestically. The second part of your question was around sequestration. And so what is well known around the world, and BC's been using it for years, is what are called market offsets or carbon credits. So BC just recently announced its results for last year in terms of our total emissions and recognized that those emissions were a little bit lower because they bought carbon offsets from British Columbia. Well, there's a vast opportunity and new technologies that make it much more viable for BC and in fact other provinces in Canada, you alluded to Saskatchewan, to use both nature-based solutions as well as technology solutions to sequester carbon. And so, for example, it can be planting more trees. The federal government's announced some of that. It can be using land to sequester carbon. Changes in agricultural practices allow soil to naturally sequester carbon, and that takes carbon out of the atmosphere and reduces global climate change. To sell those credits means that you have to verify it with high quality verification tools. And that's where we've got, again, some opportunity in BC using blockchain technology, satellite technology, and others with new companies that can be formed to verify and validate those offsets. And then lastly, there's the transaction of global banks or airlines or governments that want to get to net zero emissions for their business operations. And they have the opportunity, if we're smart, to buy those from Canada and from British Columbia. And so it creates a whole new economy around climate technology and our natural beauty and landmass that we enjoy in Canada. Susanna may have a little bit of additional conversation in the application that could apply, for example, in energy.
Okay, that's great, Greg. Thanks for the answer there. Do we have any more other questions for media? Please just put that in your chat on the screen there. And as we're waiting for any more questions from media, if there are any other participants, stakeholders, community organizations, or others on the call, please feel free to start adding some questions into the chat as well. Okay, last call for media questions, and then we'll move on to any questions from our other guests. It looks like we don't have any additional questions. So Greg, I'll turn it back to you. Oh, we've got one more that's just come in. It's from Dominique Barker, and a question about whether we're considering hydrogen exports instead of natural gas.
Well, natural gas is the global solution that is well established and is growing dramatically. And I can turn this over to Susanna Pierce from LNG Canada to give you her expert perspective on that. Hydrogen is certainly one of those things that is in the mix. It can use potentially existing infrastructure. I talked about commercially viable technology. Hydrogen is an opportunity, but it's not a proven viable commercial opportunity yet at scale. But there's companies in British Columbia and across the country investing billions of dollars on how they can exercise and create that opportunity in hydrogen. BC just invested in a hydrogen refueling station in North Vancouver as an example, but that's one in the province. So there's lots of infrastructure that takes some time to build out, and the technology takes some time to build out, to verify and use both in our everyday lives as well as commercial lives. You know, a good example is EV cars. In BC last year, we had 30,000 electric vehicles, and we're one of the early adopters of electric vehicles in the country. But in that context, those 30,000 cars are comprised within over 3 million vehicles registered in British Columbia. So while they're growing rapidly, there's still a very small toehold in the transition that takes place. And often, if you look at energy history globally, as well as in Canada, it can take decades for some of those new technologies like hydrogen to come fully into play. But Susanna, do you want to talk a little bit about really the natural gas opportunity globally and what's happening in global markets?
Sure, and I think, you know, it's a great question. I think there's a perfect energy transition that's actually happening as we speak. You have a lot of interest, as Greg was saying, in hydrogen, seeing that there's an opportunity for both blue and green hydrogen, and why not in BC? Why not in the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin where we have so much natural gas? From an export perspective, the LNG Canada project is not looking at exporting hydrogen. We're an LNG facility, liquefied natural gas. You know, and so we are looking to serve that market, which is ready and growing. It is continuing to grow. I think if I look at China, for example, right now we see year-on-year growth in LNG imports, even during this period of COVID. And we do see it continuing going into the future, because it is required to basically back out coal, not to supplant renewables. We see extensive renewable growth, but you do need something to provide baseload power. You do need something for more thermal or heat applications to heat homes, as well as to provide to industry. And LNG is that. But from a BC perspective, I think it's a great opportunity for hydrogen. I know there's a number of really unique hydrogen technologies that I've seen. And I do know that there's a lot of really interesting policy opportunities as well for the BC government and the federal government as they look at what we can do to use hydrogen as that next energy transition, which can then help to lower the carbon emissions from transportation, for example. So I think that's a great opportunity. We're not going to be exporting hydrogen, but I do believe that's part of the toolkit for British Columbia going forward.
One of the other challenges which we speak to in the report is really just the cost base, because there's hydrogen opportunities and hydrogen technology in multiple jurisdictions around the world. BC right now has what's called a very high marginal effective tax rate. What that means is if you load all the taxes combined, they're significantly higher than other provinces in the rest of the country, let alone globally. And so when we say level the playing field, if we want to seize and look at some of those opportunities, we have to be cost competitive, back to my analogy with the RSP. So if you've got 5% of your holdings as a management cost compared to 1% of your holdings, you're going to end up going to the place that has lower management costs. And in BC, it's not a race to the bottom. It's around how do we actually cut complexity and cost and not corners. And part of that tax policy that we talked to in this plan is around level the playing fields, so that we have energy intensive trade protections consistent with every other jurisdiction that has a carbon tax in the world and every other province in Canada. So that would be a good start with respect to realizing opportunities, as we've seen both in LNG, but also as we could pursue in things like hydrogen going forward.
We've got another question here from Tyler Tarnowski. How will the Clean Fuel Standard impact BC's competitiveness?
I'm not an expert in this area, but I do know that the Clean Fuel Standard in BC is something in concept that is really important and will reduce our emissions. But right now, the way it's structured, it's a bit out of sync with the rest of the country, and it's actually going to add costs. And unfortunately, the way it's structured, it actually undermines some abilities we've got to develop biofuels here in BC, which is another opportunity around new technologies going forward. Parkland Refinery is doing some phenomenal work on new biofuels. You're seeing it with Waste Solutions, waste management company, and companies in the upstream oil and gas business are doing a bunch of work on biofuels as well. But we need to create the policy certainty and the conditions necessary to develop those industries here in BC. They are developed elsewhere in the world, and in some instances we're buying those biofuels and importing them back into the province, which doesn't make any sense. The emissions happen elsewhere, but we could actually create the economic wealth, driving the innovation, and create those biofuel opportunities through things like the low carbon fuel standards. But we've got some policy work there to do to make it competitive and make it focused around the outcomes that we're all intending.
Another question here from Lisa Mathos. What are the specific proposals you have to protect EITIs? What policies or changes to the carbon tax?
Well, specifically the way that the federal government has created the framework that they implemented in January was that for energy intensive trade exposed industries, and this is in the report as well, the non-governmental environmental organizations in the country were very mindful that to avoid carbon leakage, you need to level that playing field. So Elizabeth May of the Green Party and other leaders in the environmental movement said, look, we need to have these EITI protections in Canada in order to make sure that we don't have carbon leakage. And as I explained earlier, that's where investment, jobs, and capital leave the country and end up being placed in another jurisdiction that ultimately has higher emissions. And that's acute in British Columbia, and you don't see it overnight, you see it over a period of time, but it erodes the job base and the export opportunities in BC. So specifically what we're looking for in British Columbia is a made in BC solution that gets to the average that the rest of the country's at, which is 80 to 90% protection for the $40 a ton carbon tax that we have in place in British Columbia. And so there's mechanisms to be able to do that in ways that effectively return that money back to the business. They still pay the carbon tax, but then they can reinvest that into being competitive. They can reinvest it into creating jobs. They can reinvest it into new technologies and new innovations. And they can reinvest it in partnerships with Indigenous peoples, as I laid out earlier. And one example, there's a lot of companies in British Columbia doing some great work on carbon offsets and nature-based solutions. So that opens up a whole opportunity set around moving to the transition of an innovative, clean tech economy, low carbon economy, and supporting the Clean BC initiative. So that would be a demonstrable and immediate impact of British Columbia as people start to think about their investments in the province.
Thanks, Greg. We have a question from Flynn McCarthy. How does BC compete on a TCO2e per GDP basis?
I have no idea, but I'm happy to get back to you if you want to send your email, and I'll get our experts that did the analysis on that level back.
Got a question here from Mark Hulse. What do you see as the implications of the sectoral GHG targets under the Climate Change Accountability Act?
Well, we're early days in terms of work on the sectoral targets, but they're very problematic because, as we've seen during COVID, there's a myriad of externalities that it can impact both commodity prices as well as demand in the marketplace. I think it's going to be a real challenge. I'm not aware of subnational jurisdictions that have acted on targets, and you get distortions because they're not long-term thinking, they're short-term thinking, and capital markets often will make investments over a 5 to a 30-year period of time, and the sector targets don't take that into consideration. The other thing is that they don't take into consideration often the competitive set that we've just talked about and validated today. It's all well and good to wish that we reduce emissions, but you actually have to take specific actions to economically make sure that that happens and to make sure technologically that that can happen. So there's a lot of work to be done on sectoral targets, and the Business Council is quite skeptical around our ability to meet some of those targets in the short term going forward. It doesn't say that you don't focus on it and try to make sure you're reducing emissions, but setting artificial targets without the proper information and competitive set is very problematic in our view.
Thanks, Greg. We have a question here from Richard Dunn. Richard asks, does the low carbon strategy lend itself to being a national strategy? And if so, what are your thoughts on what needs to be done to extend it to being a Canadian strategy?
I'm happy to turn that over to Susan and Susanna, who look at these issues on a national and international level as well. Every province is going to have its own advantages and disadvantages in terms of being a low carbon supplier to the world. Quebec, Manitoba, British Columbia all have substantive hydroelectric and renewable energy capacity that is an opportunity not just for their own province, but also adjacent provinces as well. We have significant opportunity to pool capital. So one of the things we offer in the plan is a center of excellence around climate and emissions innovation. And that's where we could pool together a lot of the work and thinking that's happening, not just in BC, but in Alberta and Saskatchewan, to really accelerate innovation and new technologies and new scaled companies in everything from biofuels to sequestration to methane capture going forward. So I think that there's a huge opportunity for Canada to get on its front foot and declare ourselves an energy and natural resource low carbon supplier to the world and an innovator in the world around reducing climate change going forward that has a much bigger impact on reducing global climate change than we could do if we just met our own targets under the Paris Agreement. And so in that context, we're doing some work nationally, and we've been engaging with the federal government on a regular basis. And I think there's a real collaborative opportunity to do that. But again, as some of the speakers talked about, there's high competition for capital and these opportunities around the world. For example, in mining, Australia is being very aggressive right now on trying to make it easy without cutting corners to get regulatory approval and to make investments in the marketplace. And we compete with Australia in minerals as an example. So lots of great work that can be done here in BC, lots of potential in Canada, but we need to be purposeful. We need to have a plan, and we need to execute against it at speed in the same way, as I said earlier, we did on public health with respect to managing the transmission rate and the curve of COVID. But Susanna and Susan, I don't know if you got anything you'd like to add.
I might just add that, I think, when I think about climate policy, I think even the IPCC would say that regionalized climate policies are ineffective to drive real action on climate change. And, if it were politically feasible to have more of a comprehensive approach to addressing it within Canada, I think personally that's the way to go. I believe in the carbon markets. I believe in the ability to trade where we have the natural advantages, just as BC should be trading its natural advantages for lower carbon products. So I actually think that would be great to see that this kind of a plan can be extended nationwide. I think that just gives us more ability to actually influence the positive outcome we're trying to drive, which is meeting our climate objectives as well as growing the economy in a low carbon way. So I would support that if it were something that could be achieved.
Thanks, Susanna. We've got a few more minutes left for questions from either the media or from anyone else on the phone. Please put your question in the chat and we'll answer them. For media who are on the line, if you have any interview requests, please let us know through the contacts that are in the media advisory and the media release. Greg, it looks like that's our last question then, so I'll hand it back to you.
Well, I want to thank all of our colleagues on the line, hundreds of people listening in today, and for the work that you continue to do to make us a low carbon supplier of commodities, energy, and the infrastructure and transportation necessary to make it viable and get to market. I want to thank our Indigenous partners that continue to work with BC businesses to invest and create sustainable economies going forward. And I want to thank the media for joining us today as well. I'll remind you that both a short version and the long version of the plan, as well as the MMP reports that validate the data internally, are available at lowcarbonadvantagebc.ca. That's lowcarbonadvantagebc.ca. And I'd also encourage you to share through that platform and through social media your low carbon advantage stories. There's, as I said earlier, a huge sense of pride with BC businesses and employees around what they do and how they do it. And so there's an opportunity at #LowCarbonAdvantage to be able to share that work that you're doing with the rest of the world, as we'd like to share our commodity exports and the activity and investment that are taking place in BC, that we could achieve a low carbon future together. So thanks again for joining us, and appreciate your time today.